I have a lot of pleasure introducing Dr. Tiffany Muller Myrdahl, who has been on this journey with us for over a year at least, organizing this conference. She's the Junior Ruth Wynn Woodward Chair in Gender and Urban Studies at Simon Fraser University. And she completed a Master in Public Policy degree in 2002, followed by a PhD in Geography with a Certificate in Feminist Studies in 2008, both from the University of Minnesota. She's currently on leave from the University of Lethbridge, Alberta, where she is an assistant professor of women and gender studies. I give you Tiffany.
Yay, technology. Okay, good morning. Thank you everyone for being here. More technology, I'm going to time myself. You'll hear some common themes, I think, throughout the day. And I want to start by acknowledging that we are on unceded Coast Salish territories. And I've titled my talk, Interventions for Feminist Urban Futures, and being accountable for and responsive to the ways that colonial legacies and ongoing colonial practices shape our cities is indeed an intervention that can help us to build urban futures that are grounded in equity. I want to talk about a few other interventions in my short address with the hope of helping us focus not only on the challenges that we face, but also on the important efforts that are already generating the momentum that we need to make cities work for women and girls and marginalized communities more generally. For me, Feminist Urban Futures is one strategy to conceptualize the politics, policies, and creative interventions that will foster more equitable cities. And I want to be clear here that I'm not talking about some unknowable time in the future when it will be perfect. I'm talking about, in 5 minutes when I'll tell you about some interventions that are happening, and throughout the day today when we work together to build recommendations. I think Feminist Urban Futures is a multifaceted framework, and I'm just going to share a few points of it while also offering up some already existing interventions. So the first point I want to make is related to the importance of framing, or basically how we tell stories. So in other words, it's about how we, electeds and the public more generally, frame the issues facing our cities and how urban policy discourses shape the design and the future of cities. In fact, urban policies tell a story about what's allowable, right? We know what goes where because of zoning policies. And when I moved here, I was told not even to think about letting my parking meter expire because the car would be booted and towed before the ticket was even written. So urban policies tell us about what's normal, what's unquestionable, which means that constructing cities that work for every resident must involve teasing apart the stories that existing policies tell us and taking lessons from how we might reframe and push policy in the direction of actually meeting the needs of our many diverse communities. So I have a couple of stories to illustrate this point. The first is about a little cafe called Little Nest, which is in my neighborhood. And it's a cute cafe, and it's closing in July, and news of this closing put me in a really bad mood for a good period of time. It's not a cafe that I frequent, but it's one that I appreciate because it's independently owned, it's a woman-owned business, its niche is to be kid-friendly and parent-friendly, so it caters to moms and caregivers, and it brings vibrancy to a street corner that, as I understand, suffered from a lack of vitality prior to the cafe's presence. And now the cafe is closing because the owner who rents the space got notice that she would face a 50% rent increase to the tune of $2,000 a month. So this, I think, is business as usual city making in Vancouver and in many other cities. Commercial property owners make unilateral decisions and are accountable to the city only insomuch as the uses of the property conform to city code and zoning regulations. Yet these owners' decisions have the capacity to dramatically alter the landscape and the feel of a side street, a block, even further than that. At the same time, neither the Residents Association nor the Business Improvement Society nor even the city have much capacity to intervene where quote-unquote private interests are concerned. In this capital-centric urban landscape, private owners, and particularly owners of commercial property, are not viewed so much as stakeholders, but more as empire builders. And so we appear to be, I think, stuck in a tug-of-war, negotiating between what models of public policy frame as opposing tensions: private ownership on the one hand, and public interest and implicitly social good on the other. And dog lovers in the audience can swap the titles above. You can see where I stand on that. No, I like dogs too. Because power and wealth tend to circulate through decision-making apparatuses of business as usual city making, we are left to assume that our cities can only be shaped by trying to improve upon a model whose inherent feature is benefiting one side at the expense of another. But is this the only story that we can tell about our cities and the only model that we can use to understand how resources are shared? I think not. I hope not. I think an alternative model to tug-of-war would suggest that neighborhoods and neighborhoods scaled up to cities can vision the future of their communities through dialogue and debate, things like consultation, which I'll talk about in a second, among multiple stakeholders who identify their hopes and concerns about everything from density to streetscaping, from traffic volume to neighborhood culture. This process can reframe the fight between competing interests over limited resources to an exercise of creating a vision around a shared sense of place, community assets, and strategies to collectively address neighborhood problems. In this alternative model, commercial property owners are also considered responsible stakeholders in constructing communities, and they too must be held to account, not just for their bottom line, but for how their practices affect the culture and the sense of place in the neighborhood. The alternative model, of course, requires the hard work of communicating, listening through differences, and in fact, building community, the things that Carolyn talked about in partnership. And we have to do that with those who share our values and with those people who require us to work harder to find common ground. This model of city building demands that we reframe the players involved in city making, reevaluate their roles, and enact a different model of policy development for bringing urban futures to life. I have one more example about the significance of policy framing and its ability to perpetuate a kind of endless cycle of winners and losers. And here I'm going to reference our favorite Canadian mayor, Rob Ford. As many of you, I'm sure, know, Rob Ford came to power in part through his polarizing rhetoric about the war on the car. His strategy depicted public transit and expansion of bike lanes and traffic calming as a war on the quote-unquote average car-driving citizen of Toronto, and this war was being, waged by downtown living elites who benefited from the gravy train of City Hall, blah, blah, blah. Ford basically framed two options. He said, we keep roadways for drivers and no one else, or we get an expansion of alternative modes of transportation at the expense of drivers. Those were our two options. And I think it's really easy to feel compelled to engage in the either-or scenario, which means that the folks who resent Ford's removal of bike lanes and his uber-costly plan to expand the subway system rather than use light rail, to put subway underground to get quote-unquote out of the way of cars, it encourages an equally trenchant rhetorical style. But I think at the end of the day, what then happens is that we still get stuck in this, right? It's a tug of war where one party wins because the other loses. And it means that we take a longer time to find solutions which benefit all city residents. Personally, I would like to declare a war on the car in Toronto because I find the culture of driving there very stressful as a pedestrian, as a biker, as a driver. But the fact is that outside the very small area of Toronto covered by transit, it's really difficult to live without a car. And it's a disservice to people, particularly low-income and immigrant communities who must rely on cars because they have been pushed out or have never been able to access the areas of the Toronto housing market that are well served by transit. So this story it can't continue to be either the war on the car or no cars welcome. It needs to be reframed as making city streets accessible to everyone, following a kind of complete street strategy. So I think this idea of framing and storytelling about cities, the stakes are enormous around that. The discourses we use to describe what ails our cities, the stories we tell about our cities, in many ways determines what is possible. These discourses shape what we can imagine. We need to be able to tell stories that push policy in the progressive direction it needs to go, rather than settle for stories that leave all of the business as usual logics in place and prevent us from taking stock of whom the city works for and why it works this way. Fortunately, this kind of creative storytelling is already being done. So part of the task of Feminist Urban Futures is to expand the use of existing strategies both to more places and to arenas of municipal government that have resisted challenges to business as usual city making, as well as to continue to develop innovative tools that make cities work for women, girls, marginalized communities. The most obvious example of this is a tool like the equity lens, and I'm not going to say a lot about this because Carolyn spoke to it. I think Prabha Khosla is also going to speak to it during the lunch keynote. But what I want to reiterate is the purpose of the equity lens, which is a way to evaluate all components of governance in relation to inclusion of and effects on a full diversity of a city's population: women, men, trans folks, girls, boys. I want to add that this model, that this tool needs to be employed across municipal sectors. So the equity lens is often used to evaluate things like hiring practices or city program delivery, but it's not simply meant to improve the function of certain city services like, say, pedestrian safety. Rather, it's intended to be applied across the spectrum of governance, from city budgets to garbage service. And in fact, just speaking from the conference programming committee, that was part of our incentive for putting sustainability on the agenda today in the breakout session. Vancouver's Greenest City 2020 Action Plan is an important initiative that seems to be making great strides at significantly reducing structural waste issues, but like many similar plans, it suffers from inattention to the household scale and to the bodies who are implicated in the changes that are taking place. So specifically, whose paid and unpaid labor does the Greenest City Action Plan rely upon? As importantly, the third pillar of the sustainability matrix is social sustainability, and there is a question about how social sustainability is going to factor into the policymaking on sustainable Vancouver. So my guesstimation is that the answer to this question lies in the Healthy City strategy. Once it's underway, assuming that it happens, it may or may not align with the city's vision to stay, quote unquote, on the leading edge of urban sustainability. And an equity lens would really bring these critical questions about design and policy implementation to the fore. So there are a billion more examples that I want to share with you, and I only have time to mention a few in very broad strokes. I want to speak just briefly to consultative processes, which I love Mr. T here. Consultative processes range from city committees like the Women's Advisory, which WTC was born out of, the Urban Aboriginal Peoples Advisory that Lillian Howard talked about, which is at the forefront of establishing now Reconciliation Year. I thought it was just Reconciliation Week, so that's awesome. From city committees to participatory planning, like the local area planning processes that rely on resident input, to vision and, in the best case scenario, design the future of the neighborhood. Participatory budgeting is now being suggested at City Hall as well, and this would give residents direct decision-making power over discretionary funding, so that's really exciting. There's a growing initiative to create collaborative research, collaborative participatory research. Examples, here is a piece from a scholar called Megan Cope. She worked with kids to create photo-filled maps of their neighborhoods to show where they feel safe and unsafe, and add a sense of ownership to an already existing sense of place. Just another example, a UK-based project called Rescue Geographies, which involves documenting people's personal experiences of their changing urban landscape as a way to involve them more closely with redevelopment schemes. So for many participatory projects, my research included storytelling and making spaces for voices that are not typically part of the business as usual urban development are really central strategies. Collaborative art practices demand a different kind of engagement with public spaces are another favorite example of mine around creative interventions, and there are a bajillion examples to choose from. This one is from South Hill at Fraser and 46th, which is an aesthetic redesign of an underused empty lot and intended to facilitate community building. Done by Instant Coffee, which is a local and Toronto-based collaborative art practice. Urban design seems to also becoming sort of similarly democratized through tactical urbanism style activism. And an example here is in Hamilton. It's basically low budget, short-term change that's intended to generate culture shifts in the city and then bring about long-term change. So in this example, an intersection cited by pedestrians as being threatening, like a threatening place to cross the street, was given a temporary redesign to slow traffic because of the addition of pylons, and it was this strategy, not the actually endless years of campaigning, thanks, or I should say probably building on the endless years of campaigning, that prompted city officials to actually change and buy in to traffic calming. So while several of these examples that I'm talking about here they don't explicitly identify themselves as feminist, and that for me is okay. For me, if there is an activity that aims to address and somehow redress disparity and tackle progressive community change, it's an intervention that works toward feminist urban futures. And I'll just give one more example here. So web-based activism, which of course we all have many examples. I'd love to hear more from you in the break. This one is from a website called good.is, and it's a subsection called cities. This example that I pulled features Sunday Soup, which uses food as a catalyst to bring people together and create opportunities for conversation and social change in Detroit, and apparently happens in cities at least around the US, if not around the world. So I'm still a scholar, though, so I have to hasten to add here that there's always a risk of romanticizing participation. And I want to be very clear that it still matters who shows up for these voluntary sessions. If there's no investment on the part of the city, for example, to ensure the diversity of voices by doing things like offering food, free childcare, transit passes, holding them at various times so different people can be involved, these processes lose their capacity to function as a force of progressive change. Moreover, community engagement must be more than just lip service, which brings me basically to the overall points I want to make about the toolkit that I've been talking about, namely that they have to be tweaked as well. There's often a massive gap between participatory process and policy. So to name one example, advisory committees and local area planning processes have an important capacity to make recommendations and even identify demands, but those demands are often toothless, and they are situated still within this tug-of-war model where the city sees itself as needing to take a less interventionist approach to things like, for example, developers who promise to raise the city's tax base through some residential development project. So all of this means that actually encouraging people to participate with no commitment that their concerns will be taken seriously risks reinforcing already existing feelings of disenfranchisement. It's also worth noting that there is still a tangible bias as to what kind of knowledge is perceived as valid and therefore valuable, which means that certain voices and certain bodies become less hearable or legible in the participatory process. And we can imagine what this looks like, right? People who are racialized in particular ways or othered in particular ways, who have certain experiences that make others feel uncomfortable in the act of sharing, experiences like racism and violence. All of these embodied experiences of urban life are often framed as being of questionable value in participatory process, in process that quite honestly place stock in a more middle-class version of expertise. So experiences of the city that are marked as too different to be legible in quote-unquote traditional engagement processes are often relegated to more experimental sites like storytelling. And while I am a massive advocate for sharing stories as a way to negotiate social inclusion and create policy, I can also tell you that stories shared in experimental sites are often even further outside the scope of a policymaker's attention. So as with anything else, we must be critically thoughtful in our adoption and use of engagement strategies and tools that we want to serve as interventions for feminist urban futures. And it goes without saying that we should never assume that that battle has been won for good. This is from earlier this year, Reclaim Prior. Some challenges need to be confronted over and over again. Traffic calming, when it's ignored, you just need to keep confronting the city with it. So in closing, I want to offer that this vision is not one-dimensional, it is intersectional and feminist, which means that feminist urban futures does not and cannot focus exclusively on women. As we know, it's not simply along lines of gender and gender identity that women face discrimination. We all contend with the ways that class and race, able-bodiedness and sexuality, age and immigrant status, and all markers of visible and invisible difference are mutually produced, and they structure our experiences of being othered. And those experiences are different in different places. The ways that our identities are felt and experienced are intimately tied to these spaces that we occupy. So the complexity of our lives requires our focus to be on equity, but not through the singular lens of gender. And at the same time, we need to ensure, and this I think is really tough, we need to ensure that gender doesn't disappear. So my very last point, I promise. I'm really pleased to be a relative newcomer to the massive Divided Cities research team, which is now a 6-city study that examines rising income inequality across Canada. So far, this research has done an amazing job illustrating what it means for places like Toronto and Vancouver, for example, to become more gentrified within the urban core, and what this means for the ongoing displacement of the working poor, whether or not that work is paid or unpaid, as well as what it means for new immigrants. And the slide here speaks to recent immigrants by census tract, and I'm sorry I couldn't fit them on the same slide. The slide here is average household incomes, and what we all see is that the areas with less racialized, fewer people of color, fewer new immigrants are wealthier. And of course, that's more complicated in Vancouver, but that is the general trend. What it doesn't tell us, what this data doesn't tell us, though the stats should be readily available at the census tract level, is how disproportionately represented women are in low-income CMAs. So we need to reclaim this analysis for our own ends and make sure gender remains a central concern and consideration. So the tasks ahead of us are perhaps daunting, but I think together as people transforming cities to be the ideal places they can be for women and girls and all who have been historically left out of traditional city-making processes, we can face this challenge confidently. Thank you.